Hello. Um, Sorry that was so awkward. Sometimes the technology doesn't quite cooperate, but we're here now, and we will begin again. Can you hear me now, Penelope? I hope so. All right, terrific. We're live and on stream. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about love versus the power devil, and also about logos and eros, which is one of my favorite topics. And I hope this will be useful. So I'm going to begin by reading from Memory Stream's Reflections by C.G. Jung. This is Dr. Jung's autobiography of the development of his own psyche. And I'm going to read from the very last 2 pages of the book. You can see how I've marked it up quite heavily throughout the book. There is a later section called Retrospect, but in this last section called Late Thoughts, Dr. Jung is talking about love. And so I want to begin by telling you about love from Dr. Jung's point of view. So I'm reading from Memory Stream's Reflections, page 353. At this point, the fact forces itself on my attention that beside the field of reflection, there is another equally broad, if not broader, area in which rational understanding and rational modes of representation find scarcely anything they are able to grasp. This is the realm of eros. In classical times, when such things were properly understood, eros was considered a god whose divinity transcended our human limits, and who therefore could neither be comprehended nor represented in any way. I might, as many before me have attempted to do, venture an approach to this demon whose range of activity extends from the endless spaces of the heavens to the dark abysses of hell. But I falter before the task of finding the language which might adequately express the incalculable paradoxes of love. Eros is a cosmogonus, a creator and father-mother of all higher consciousness. I sometimes feel that Paul's words, "Though I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, I have not love," unquote, might well be the first condition of all cognition and the quintessence of divinity itself. Whatever the learned interpretation may be of the sentence, "God is love," the words affirm the complexio oppositorum of the Godhead. In my medical experience, as well as in my own life, I have again and again been faced with the mystery of love, and have never been able to explain what it is. Like Job, I had to, quote, "lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer." Job 40, verse 4 and following. Here is the greatest and the smallest, the remotest and the nearest, the highest and the lowest, and we cannot discuss one side of it without also discussing the other. No language is adequate to this paradox. Whatever one can say, no words express the whole. To speak of partial aspects is always too much or too little, for only the whole is meaningful. Love bears all things and endures all things. 1 Corinthians 13:7. These words say all there is to be said. Nothing can be added to them. For we are in the deepest sense the victims and the instruments of cosmogonic love. I put the word in quotation marks to indicate that I do not use it in its connotations of desiring, preferring, favoring, wishing, and similar feelings, but as something superior to the individual, a unified and undivided whole. Being apart, man cannot grasp the whole. He is at its mercy. He may assent to it or rebel against it, but he is always caught up by it and enclosed within it. He is dependent upon it and is sustained by it. Love is his light and his darkness, whose end he cannot see. Love ceases not. Whether he speaks with the tongues of angels or with scientific exactitude traces the life of the cell down to its uttermost source, man can try to name love, showering upon it all the names at his command, and still he will not involve himself in he will involve himself in endless self-deceptions. If he possesses a grain of wisdom, he will lay down his arms and name the unknown by the more he will lay down his arms and name the unknown by the more If he possesses a grain of wisdom, he will lay down his arms and name the unknown by the more unknown, ignotum per ignotius. That is, by the name of God. That is, by the name of God. That is a confession of his subjection, his imperfection, and his dependence, but at the same time, a testimony. To his freedom to choose between truth and error. Okay, so we're talking about logos and eros here, and the power devil. And so, first of all, I want to understand. I want to help you understand what we're talking about. So last Monday, we had a fire in Notre Dame. Now, is Notre Dame gone? What do you think? Is Notre Dame gone? Okay. My answer to that is no. Notre Dame is something different from the building, the structure. The structure is just a pile of rocks and timber that's glued together. But there's something irrational that is in the lives of everyone that's listening to this. Okay, you've all seen a picture of Notre Dame, and it may mean something to you, and we cannot rationally talk about what that is. But the reality is that Notre Dame is that pile of masonry and wood is a symbol for something else. It's a symbol for cosmogonic love. And that symbol has driven men for 800 years, and men and women who built the cathedral and then used it for many years. But again, the building is only the logos. It's the shell. But within that, we have to bring our life, our eros, and our meaning. And so the idea that Notre Dame is gone is not correct at all, because Notre Dame lives in our hearts, in the irrational side of our being, and the logos will rebuild it, certainly. And there's a place for the logos. You know, everything that you have in your life that's a material thing, like this pen, has to be built by logos, because it has to be 100% correct in order for it to be something. And that goes for an automobile or anything else you ever own. But Dr. Jung pointed out that there's a distinction, the opposition, and everything in psychic energy is an opposition. The opposition to love is the power devil, and that operates through logos, and so it operates through the rational and not the irrational side. And this is why whenever you meet a bully, the bully is manifesting the power devil. But as my father taught me in the 4th grade, a hard-boiled egg is always yellow inside. And why is that? It's because if he has to manifest being a bully, then there's nothing behind it. He's not courageous. He's not truly brave. He's got a persona out there that's protecting his teeny weeny little ego from being attacked. And so as soon as you call him on his bulliness, you find out that there's nothing behind him. And so, you know, whatever happened, whether by an act of God or an act of man at Notre Dame, the point is that neither God nor man can take Notre Dame away from us. And God, of course, knows this. And so the destruction of the building last Monday could be a part of God's plan. God works in mysterious ways. If it's a plan of a man, that plan is obviously false, because we will have Notre Dame rebuilt again one day, and as we did with the World Trade Centers. And so these things live in our heart, not in the physical world. And this is Dr. Jung's point. And so let's see. Okay, so, but the interesting point is that even Dr. Jung didn't quite get it. He explained it, and he didn't quite get his problem. Okay, so how is that true? Well, he didn't quite get it because he was a scientist, and in order to protect himself from the attacks of theologians, and well, especially of theologians, while he was talking about religion, he was very precise in talking about the fact that he was a scientist, and everything he talked about he could prove with evidence, with direct experience. And so that was a problem, because he never quite bridged the gap between being a scientist and the irrational. He almost everything he talked about in his work was about the irrational, but he did it in a scientific way, so he never could bridge that gap quite. And so I want to read to you a favorite paragraph of mine, which is a clear demonstration of that. And that's in this book, Ion: Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self by C.G. Jung. And you can see in this paragraph his consternation that he has never been able to bridge that gap between the rational and the irrational. And the fact is, we need to grok, we need to understand at our deepest level that we have to have both logos and eros in our lives. I mean, pure logos leads to greed and survival of the fittest, and that sort of idea, which has been pushing back into our politics in the United States. But that idea is lame. It's one-sided. And so let me read this paragraph to you, and then I'll explain it. Paragraph 63. The shadow, the syzygy, and the self are psychic factors of which an adequate picture can be formed only on the basis of a fairly thorough experience of them. Just as these concepts arose out of an experience of reality, so they can be elucidated only by further experience. In other words, not by words. You actually, in order to understand something psychologically, you have to experience it. So philosophical criticism will find everything to object to in them, unless it begins by recognizing that they are concerned with facts and that the concept is simply an abbreviated description or definition of those facts. Such criticism has as little effect on the object as zoological criticism on a duck-billed platypus. It is not the concept that matters. The concept is only a word, a counter, and it has meaning and use only because it stands for a certain sum of experience. Unfortunately, I cannot pass on this experience to my public. I have tried in a number of publications with the help of case material to present the nature of these experiences and also the method of obtaining them. Wherever my methods are really applied, the facts I give have been confirmed. One could see the moons of Jupiter even in Galileo's day if one took the trouble to use his telescope. Okay, so the point is that words, and we've had the Bible as the word, right? And that the word brought us belief in God, let's say. Certainly it did. But that's the logos, and it allowed the development of European history over 2,000 years, and before that, Jewish history and Muslim history, because Muslim history also goes back to Abraham. And so, but the point is that, if you own a Bible, that Bible is only a doorstop unless you put life into it. Okay, it's logos, it's got lots of words in it, but those words have no meaning unless you put meaning into them. And the meaning is on the irrational side, on the love side. So in this paragraph, where he refers to zoological criticism, okay, so you've got a zoologist who wants to talk about the duck-billed platypus, and he wants to say that, it doesn't make any sense, this animal, but the duck-billed platypus who lives in Australia and Tasmania, those animals could care less about the zoological criticism. So you've got all this logos, all these words talking about this creature, but the creature goes on living nonetheless. And the words, the logos, has no meaning whatsoever to the creature. And so when we talk about BTS and what's going on with BTS, we've had a time in world history now which has been very, very pushed by the logos, and this idea that if if I'm going to win, you have to lose. And obviously that's baloney. And it's forcing upon us this tribalism, which is out of place because it's not consistent with humanity and what humanity does. As a creature, we're different from that, okay? And survival of the fittest is appropriate in evolutionary history, but it's not a very good way to develop. Okay, so Dr. Jung pointed out that God was really not only vaguely conscious, okay, because it took God hundreds of millions of years, even billions of years, to develop creatures that were not human beings. And so that's not the act of a very conscious being. But when humanity came along, now we can be conscious and we can manifest God's consciousness. That's why we're created in the image of God, if you will. And so what we need for the next level of consciousness is to understand that we need both. We need logic and we need the irrational. We need the rational and the irrational, because the rational will get us products like the eyeglasses I'm wearing or the camera that I'm looking through. All of these things, all these material things that we have in our world, we have to do by logos and by the word, because we have to have a methodology by which we're going to make these, and they have to be made exactly the same and perfectly every time. And if they're not made perfectly, then the business goes away, of course. But when you have all these things, then you have to put life into them. There's no life in a thing. And so if you get a dream that one day you want to own a Mercedes, or one day you want to build a tower, as our president has done, you can play Game of Thrones, you can cheat, you can build a building by people's labor and then not pay them, as apparently has been the case of our president. But in the end, it's vacuous. And so I don't think there's anybody here, including the president himself, if he ever were to watch this video, who can say that that man is a happy man. Okay, you can't have a happy life by just going for the material things. It just doesn't happen. And so the concept of love, while it's irrational, as I read to you at the beginning of this, the concept of love is irrational, but we need it in our lives. And so that's the symbolism of BTS and the BTS Army. It's irrational. It's not rational. If I were to discuss, or even any expert on pop culture before BTS came along, if any expert on pop culture could imagine through the word what BTS is, what they've done, and what they represent, they could not possibly have done it. Okay, and even if they could have done it, it probably couldn't have happened in that case, because the irrational side of the love that is manifested by BTS armies exactly represents what I'm talking about. In other words, let's say the K-pop industry were to try to invent BTS, they couldn't have done it, because by inventing it, it would have been too rigid, and it would not have drawn any of you as BTS fans to the group, but it's the organic living aspect of BTS and the troubles they've been through and so on, which has drawn people around the world and caused by word of mouth, not an understanding. It's not logic, so it can't be an understanding. You have to grok it. You either get it or you do not get it. And, you know, the word grok, I urge you to look up on Wikipedia. It's a word that can't be defined in a sentence, and it's based on a novel by, I think it's Robert Heinlein, called A Stranger in a Strange Land. But in any case, and that's the point, okay? When you talk about grokking something, it's not understanding it, it's understanding it at the deepest level. And so understanding it at the deepest level means understanding it from an irrational point of view as well as a rational point of view. Okay, so now we'll go back and look at your comments. Okay. Thank you for waiting, Moonchild. I appreciate it. And good morning, everyone. And Penelope says, love is a beautiful subject and so misunderstood. Precisely it is. And why would God set Notre Dame ablaze? Well, as I said, and I don't know the site in the Bible, but God works in mysterious ways. And maybe God wanted humanity to start understanding the significance of the irrational. And so, you know, is this photograph, is that Notre Dame? Well, no, it's not. Was the pile of rocks and the glass and the beautiful artworks, was that Notre Dame? No, it wasn't, because Notre Dame is still here with me and with all of you in some way that is irrational and you cannot explain it. So Notre Dame still lives, but it lives in a different place, and it's, you know, the same as death. You know, when a person dies, are they dead? Well, actually, no, they're not. And you know, their physical life as an animal goes away. And so I have a favorite person who says, when you're dead, you don't know you're dead. It only is difficult for your family. When you're stupid, it works the same way. And so anyone that's had to cremate their parents knows that the cremation of that body had nothing to do with the living nature of your parents. And so my parents live with me and through me forever. They always will. And as I've spoken to others about my parents go on in their spirit, living through you, maybe not consciously, but they do go on. And my brother as well. My brother died from something very logical and rational. He drank polluted water, believe it or not, in Vail, Colorado. And this is why I'm fastidious about the water I drink. He drank polluted water in Vail, Colorado, which is supposed to be mountain spring water, right? And because of that, an amoebic creature got into his colon, worked its way up into his liver, and ultimately caused him to have 3 liver transplants. And ultimately, he died in 1988 at the age of 39. So that's the facts. But the irrational side of that is that my brother is still with me every bit as much as he ever was. And so that part of my brother is immortal. And now that I've told you this story, that part of my brother goes on living through you. Whether you ever consciously remember this anecdote or not, the fact is that his spirit will go on living around the world because I've just told this anecdote. And so in the case of Notre Dame, yes, we lost a beautiful building, but it was just a thing. It was a structure, and we are going to rebuild the thing, but that isn't what Notre Dame is. That thing is just a symbol for what's in our heart, the irrational side. And so that's what I'm trying to say. And so why would God have set it ablaze? Maybe God set it ablaze so that we could have this conversation today. I don't know. I mean, God works in mysterious ways, and I'm not trying to put ideas into God. I'm simply saying that Notre Dame still lives, and the cathedral that is located in Paris, France, will be rebuilt. There's no doubt in my mind about that. And what that cathedral is symbolic of has not been destroyed in any way, okay, and will continue in our hearts until there is another symbol built. But that is all rational. The irrational side, the part of Notre Dame that's really important to us as human beings, hasn't been touched, okay? So, and God knows this. Eric says, when I saw the Notre Dame burning, I thought about a situation in Europe. Europe is on fire. Well, I mean, symbolically, Europe is on fire, and symbolically, the fire needs to be controlled. But fire is not always bad. Fire, if it's properly controlled and used, we use it all the time. We use it in our automobiles every day because our automobiles are on fire too. So we have to have a middle ground where we can't have fire out of control, as was the case with Notre Dame. But at the same time, we need fire because that's how we build civilization. And so Carlos says, is this why his red book was never published? I think it was never published, Carlos, because he knew that humanity at that time was not ready to understand it. And I think he was afraid that, and this is all me thinking, it's not anything I've ever read, but I think he probably was afraid that if it was published and not in a good way, or, you know, not in this beautiful way in which it's been presented, that, you know, it would just become another thing, another book that has no meaning to anyone. But over the last 50 years, or over the 48 years until it was published after his death, humanity has evolved somewhat, and Sono Shamdasani was driven to bring it to the public and to put life into it, and so now we are ready to understand it and understand what the unconscious is, what complexes in the unconscious is, what psychogenic figures in the unconscious are, or when they're perceived in real life as visions. We're ready to perceive that rather than be frightened by it. And for example, you know, I had a psychogenic vision one time of Mephistopheles, the one I imagined from reading Faust, plopping down in the seat next to me in my car. Now, fortunately, I was already knowledgeable about Jungian psychology at that time, but I So I had to cut the Faustian bargain, and I did, which was one of my daughters had said, "You're going to hell." And at that moment, I went to hell. Okay. I literally went to hell. And Mephistopheles came and sat down next to me, and I'm going 65 miles an hour down a highway. Now, this is a real thing. It's a psychogenic fact that Mephistopheles is sitting in the car next to me. So I made the Faustian bargain, which was that he could have my immortal soul on my death, provided my daughters never thought that of me again for the rest of my life, my physical life. And when I made that bargain, boom, he left. Okay, he just disappeared again. So he went back into my psyche. Now I can imagine that people have been having dreams and visions of God since forever. Okay, they're all chronicled in the Bible, for example, and in the Quran, and in various other places, and in the Bhagavad Gita. And so traditionally, over the last 2,000 years, then the priest or the minister would say to you, "Well, you were visited by the devil. That means you have to be a good little person and give enough money to the church and so on." And so churches were built to protect people, and so that's how intermediaries, priests, ministers, and monks or whoever intermediated between human beings and man, because man didn't know what was happening. But if you read the Bible closely, you realize that the big miracles, the miracles like the Annunciation, the angel coming to Mary, was in a dream, and the angel coming to Joseph, her betrothed, came in a dream. And so that was certainly a miracle, because even today, an unwed mother in that part of the world could easily be stoned to death, okay, even today. And so it certainly was a miracle that she could deliver Jesus Christ as a manifest, a physical person. But we have to understand our psychology too. And so anyway, that's a long... so anyway, going back to the Red Book then, I think that Dr. Jung didn't think that humans were ready to talk about complexes representing themselves as physical beings at that time. But Sonu Shamdasani did see the value of it, and it's proven to be very helpful, and it's completely changed the way Jungian analysts think about Dr. Jung and his work. But the irony is, there's a huge irony, and that is that Jungian analysts don't necessarily think that they should know and be able to know about the Red Book. So I actually, in Dr. Jung's tradition, if you're going to be an analyst, you have to have an analyst. And so at one point in that spirit, I started to look for a Jungian analyst to work with in terms of my own work. And what I found out was one of the ones I went to hadn't read the Red Book. Okay, and Dr. Stein, Murray Stein, the author of the book that is the basis of this Murray Stein, says on a video that you can find on this channel, it's an interview between Murray Stein and Peter Kingsley. He says, "Well, I'm not sure we should talk about the Red Book in Jungian institutes." So they're training Jungian analysts, and they have been training Jungian analysts for the best part of a century now, And yet one of the leading Jungian analysts in the world is not convinced that the Red Book should be taught in the Jung Institutes. My God. Okay. So, they are, they do teach people to be mental health professionals. There's no doubt about that. And I'm not a mental health professional, so you can take what I say with a grain of salt. But the very idea that Mary Stein would make that comment is just beyond my comprehension. And the irony is that there's a series of 3 books called Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. And that series is co-edited by Murray Stein. and so I said, oh my God, my head hurts. But when you read that series, you see how much life there is there, because what it is a series of 50 essays, more than 50 essays now, because there now is going to be a 4th volume. The 3rd volume is being published this month, but there's now going to be a 4th volume. And the point is that those 50 Jungian analysts all have slightly different ways of thinking about the Red Book. And so it's like the Red Book was this uncut diamond, and each one of these Jungian analysts is slicing off their facet of that diamond. And as they slice it off, it reveals the beauty of this diamond more and more. And so, the Red Book represents the visioning experience of Dr. Jung, which lasted 5 years. And Dr. Jung was lucky because he was a practicing psychiatrist when he went through that process, and he went through it quite professionally. But when it first began, he didn't know what was happening to him. He thought he was possibly facing a psychosis. And he had, in the Red Book, they described this, he had 5 dreams or visions in the year 1913 and 1914, 5 dreams and visions that were quite shocking. Okay, they included a dream where there's blood flooding all of Europe and coming right up into the Alps, and lots of death and destruction in his vision. And he was in Aberdeen, Scotland, giving a lecture on August the 1st, 1914, when World War I broke out. And he comments that he was the happiest man on earth that day, because that told him that what he had done had a connection to the collective unconscious, and the collective unconscious of Europe knew that there was going to be a war, but at an unconscious level. And these dreams were manifestations of that. There were prefigurations of that. And so on August the 1st, 1914, he's in Scotland. He decides to go back home by the fastest route. And the events of his dreams and visions came through and actually happened in real life. And so that was his discovery right there of the collective unconscious. And so then he went on to talk about it. And later on, he said that the Red Book is his prima materia. It means his raw material, his chaos, if you will. And so he then spent the next 50 years of his life, more than 50 years, almost 60 years, explaining it And that's what his collected works were to explain what was happening to him at that time. And it so happened, and I didn't know about this, of course, in 1993, because the Red Book wasn't published until 2009. And so in 1993, I was reading a book by a Jungian analyst named Clarissa Pinkola Estes called Women Who Run with the Wolves. And she was talking about these archetypal stories and fairy tales that come through humanity. And when you do that, and when you are introduced that in a conversation like this, these things can start to happen to you. So you should be warned that you can start to have a dream or a vision that you weren't expecting before, because your conscious mind is suddenly letting that have a possibility of getting through. You haven't repressed it. And but I didn't know that in 1993, and I wasn't a mental health professional. I was a very logic-oriented guy, logos guy, like most people. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life, because I was unemployed at that time, which was shocking to me. It was a terrible midlife crisis, because I had practiced law. I was a licensed attorney. I have an MBA degree. I speak Japanese and Chinese. I had just spent 5 years building a company in Japan. And so I thought that I could walk on water, but nobody cared. And when I was 39 years old, they thought I was too old. The excuse for not hiring somebody in that situation is you're overqualified. Okay, so I was overqualified, and I was knocked to the side. I lost basically everything. I lost my family. I had a divorce at that time, all sorts of things. And so I'm troubled trying to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. And I decided that I wanted to be a writer. And then I realized that I had been a writer all my life, but I had been writing for other people. And so I decided, well, I'm going to write a novel. And so I read Michael Crichton, an interview with Michael Crichton, and he was talking about Jurassic Park. And he was asked the question, how do you write a novel? And Michael Crichton's answer was, you ask a question and then answer it. And so that led me to think about an incident that occurred between my father and I when I was 15 years old. And it had been working on me in my unconscious for all those years, from 1962 to 1993, so 31-year period. But the question was, when we moved into a house on the Japanese economy in Kamakura, Japan, because my mother didn't want us to live on Little America, the bases. And so we lived in a private house in Kamakura, which is a famous ancient capital of Japan. It's the home of the great Buddha of Kamakura, and it's the home of Hachiman Shrine. And as I say, it was a capital in ancient Japan. And so it's filled with culture. And so when we moved into that place, we found that my mother could afford to employ a servant, somebody to help us. And we had a servant's quarters in the house that we lived. It was a very small room, but basically just big enough to have a bed and a chest in it. But we found a young woman who was 23 years old, who could live with us and help my mother with washing dishes and making meals. And so at some point, I was 15 years old, so there was a certain anima thing going on with me, between me and Michiko-san, this woman. And So I asked my father, how is Michiko here? And he said, well, in Japan, uh, Japanese women who live in the farms and so on come to Tokyo to earn their dowry. Okay, that's all he said. Young women come to Tokyo to earn their dowry, okay, in terms of Japanese culture at that time, 1962. And and so when I was thinking about wanting to write, I thought about that statement that came to my mind, and so I probably hadn't thought about it consciously in 20 years, but for some reason that statement came to my mind. And I had subsequently had a lot of experience in Japan. I went to high school there, and then I went away for 16 years, and then I went back in business and built a company there for 5 years. And so I had a lot of experience with Japanese culture, both men and women. And so the question I decided to ask to create this novel was, what would happen if a woman like that came to Tokyo to earn her dowry and ultimately, at the other end of her life, turns out to be the first woman prime minister of Japan? What would that life be like? And so I started this novel as at age 15, and I wrote the novel through age 75. Now, of course, in that context, it's very, very cheeky of me as a man to think I could write a memoir of a woman. And the title of the novel is Meiko, Memoirs of a Woman. Okay, that's the novel. And it's written under my pen name, which is David Garrettson. So I can put that in too. And I wrote it under a pen name because some of the material in there is adult, let's say, quite adult. And I later realized that this novel was an autobiography of my anima for that 31-year period from 1962 to 1993. But what happened to me was that I started to have psychogenic experiences as I was writing the novel. And so that was a visioning period for me that lasted 8 months. And the way it worked was every morning, Mako, the image of Mako, would wake me up at 6 a.m. and make me sit down at my computer and type until I wrote 500 to 1,000 words, until I wrote the next part of this novel and telling her story. And so I would go into my computer, I would turn the monitor down as low as I could so it wouldn't wake me up, so that I could just let the unconscious present this material, and the novel wrote itself. And so I thought what I was having was an experience like most novel writers have, where they get something from the unconscious, and the best ones get the best stuff from the unconscious. And that if you're cut off from that, that's writer's block. And so that was my logical thinking about that period of time, that this was just stuff coming, and maybe I could be a writer, a fiction writer. And so I just let it happen. I didn't think I was crazy at all. But because of the adult content of the novel, I decided not to publish it at that time, and I put it in my drawer for 21 years. But in 2009, when the Red Book came out, I said, wow, to myself, wow, Dr. Jung had a visioning experience like this too. And so and this is what it's about. So then I got into it even more so after the Red Book was published. And so you can see that when people have those sorts of dreams or visions, they can really question their own mental health. And, certainly I was. And, I was also questioning and still do question the the material that was there. And obviously some of that material is from the shadow. And so, but my ego told me not to publish this yet because I'm not sure I want this in my life, in my physical life. And I'm not sure I want to bring it into society. But now the reason I do talk about it is that I understand it. And I understand that this is the spirits coming from your unconscious, and that it makes sense to have control over that shadow part. And so I can explain it to you. And the irony is, I was very worried about how women would react to what I had written, which I based on a template that was in Dr. Estes' book in the hardbound copy. Let's see. I always keep this book within arm's reach, Women Who Run with the Wolves, Myths and Stories of the Wild Woman Archetype by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And there's a story in here, which is on page 74 of the hardbound version, called The Doll in Her Pocket, Vasilisa the Wise. This is the story. And at the end of this story, Dr. Estes gave about a 40-page dissertation on the psychological process that a woman goes through during the development of her intuition. And so I decided I would use that template as the basis of my novel, as a sort of map of how I wanted to write the novel. And so I did that. But as I said, I was still worried about the content. And my wife, who's a very wise woman, refused to read what I had written until I had had 10 other women read it. And so I was pretty worried about that. But I started to have women read it. It happened that I operated at that time in an industry that was largely women. So I had a lot of women around me, and I started to let them read my novel. And everyone that ever said anything to me about it actually loved the novel. And so that gave me courage. And ultimately, I probably showed it to maybe 100 women. But I still kept it. But ultimately, I showed it to my wife after I achieved the benchmark of getting 10 women to read it. I showed it to my wife and then to my mother, and they liked it. And so that was very encouraging, and it told me a lot of things, and really drew me further and further into Jungian psychology as a result of that. And so Carlos, in answer to your question then, why was it never published? I'm trying to give you a sense of my thinking about when I was visioning and what were my considerations and so on. And I can imagine that similar considerations were in Dr. Jung's thinking. And that's why he kept the Red Book aside. And on many of these pages, I've offered a link to the opening of the Red Book initially. When Sonu Shamdasani got permission to publish it, they opened it, and there's a 3.5-minute video that is brilliant, a very beautiful video about opening the Red Book. And one of the characters in the thing says, I felt like I was in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so I'm sorry I have to use the restroom. I'll be back in a moment. Apologies. Okay, so now Sean says, do you think love without trust is impossible? Well, I don't think it's impossible. You know, I still love my first wife, but I don't know that she would trust me in the way she did when we were married together. I sort of think of her in the type of love of a sister now. And so we handled our divorce in a very mature fashion. So we stayed in touch. I spent a lot of time with my daughters when they were growing up. Um, Not as much as I would have if I were in the house, but I maintained my love for my daughters, and the love I had for my wife at that time transformed into a love like a sibling, like a sister. And so now my wife and I can go out to dinner with my ex-wife and her new husband, and everything is perfectly fine. And so that's a kind of love, but she wouldn't necessarily trust me in the same way that she trusted me at the time we were married. So I think love is possible without trust. Um, and then you expand on that by saying self or outer. Um, well, Dr. Jung's passage that I read at the beginning of this video, says that, you can't rationally discuss love. I mean, it is or it isn't, and it's irrational, but it's a part of life and we can't ignore it. And then there could be a secret unconscious love if the conscious mind isn't fully evolved for the problem at hand. Absolutely. And also, one of the things that Dr. Jung says very near to this passage is that having a secret is important. A secret is numinous. And so, if you think of someone that you have a secret between you and that person, that's a bond between the two of you that is a kind of love, and it's obviously if you told the secret that you share between the two of you, there would be no trust, and maybe the love would be damaged as well. And so but anyway, you can have secret unconscious love, and ultimately that love can become conscious too. And BTS Army says, without trust, I think love can exist. And I do agree, as I've said. Is it love if it's not at the full manifestation then? Sure. I mean, you can have puppy love between little kids. I mean, I certainly thought I was in love with various little girls that were in my classes. I actually can remember the name of one from the second grade. And so I thought I was in love then. And that was very superficial love, but it was an anima projection on that little girl that, the next year there was another one, and so on. And I moved out of that school and moved to another school, and my anima goes, well, okay. Let's see. So anyway, there wasn't a full manifestation of love in that time. And obviously sexuality isn't necessarily love. And it's something, it may be something else. It can be love. It can be an element of love, but love has to be much more than just passion and eroticism in order for it to be true love, soulmate love. And he says, maybe it's a phase like the moon or buried into the dirt and part of the magma of the earth. Well, yeah, I mean, it is a phase. So, it's an instinctual, it comes first. We are conscious of it first from instinct. And so we love our mother because she's feeding us at the beginning. And, then for a little boy, that probably sets his anima figure in some way. And then, once you have your anima functional, operating, constellated, then your anima is going to keep looking for the perfect woman for you, or the perfect partner for you, whatever that is. So these are archetypal activities, processes. And, in this book, I didn't read it, but let's see, where is it? In the very next section. So I'm referring again to Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And I read this section about love, but on page 356, in retrospect, he says, knowledge of processes in the background early shaped my relationship to the world. And so, in some sense, love is a process. It's a psychological process that has different definitions from different points of view and at different levels. And so those things are worth thinking about. Penelope says, Skip, can you explain the meaning in your words what logos means? Well, logos refers to rationality, and logos refers to the word, as in the book of John, in the beginning was the word. Well, in the beginning was the word, because before that beginning, there were obviously creatures that were almost human. Okay, let's say there were great apes that were evolving, and they were almost human. But at the time we made the crossover to being human was the time that we could communicate through some sort of word. So this is why in John it says, in the beginning was the word. Well, in the beginning of the human species, as an identifiable different species that has risen to a new level of consciousness at that point, at the beginning of Genesis, or at the beginning of any cosmological beginning as humans have described it, at that point in time, we became able to abstract, and we ate from the tree of good and evil. So we started to understand that there were some things that we should have in our civilization and some things that we should not, that we should repress. And so that was really the beginning of civilization. And let's see. And so the word was the beginning of the human species at another level. So all other animals are still in the gross participation mystique. They have awareness. It's not consciousness in the sense we're talking about. They have awareness and they have instinct, and they live by instinct. And so they develop based on evolutionary principles. But human beings don't have to evolve in that sort of bumper car style of evolution. Okay, and in the lower animals, the evolution is just bang, 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 and so the faster rabbits survive, and the faster eagles keep catching the faster rabbits, and so the rabbits get faster and faster, and the eagle gets better and better eyesight as a result. That's evolution. And, that's kind of a bumper car's way of evolving. But once we had the logos and the idea of good and evil and the ability to abstract, then we came to a new level of consciousness originally. Okay, so think of that as the beginning of the Old Testament. And then God had to become man. And this was prefigured all the way back to earlier times. Dr. Jung talks about this at very great length, but and especially in Answer to Job is one good place to get a summation of it. But Job recognized that there is both a good and a bad side of God. And so when he was having his trials of Job, he decided to focus on the good side of God. So he never gave up on God. And that's why in all the Abrahamic religions, Job is so highly respected, because he never gave up on God, even though bad things were happening to him. And so just because Notre Dame burned, here we go, if that's an act of God, that's the bad side of God. And and just because Europeans destroyed their civilization twice in the 20th century, in World War I and World War II, that's the evil side of God. But that doesn't mean that we give up on God. And you can repress that as the Soviets did. So the Soviets repressed the good side of God for 70 years, and you couldn't be a practicing Christian because religion is the opiate of the people. Well, that's not the right way to think about it. And so obviously that putting that structure in and saying, oh yeah, now we know things and we don't have to worry about church, we'll just do everything logically. Well, if you do everything logically, you get the Soviet Union and the gulags. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed, religion came back into the Soviet Union. All the churches and so on were rebuilt quite beautifully, as I understand. I haven't seen them, but you can't kill that part of yourself. And so thinking that everything is going to be on the logos side, on the rational side, it just doesn't work that way, because this did not destroy Notre Dame. Okay, Notre Dame is still here with us. It's with us in this conversation. And, the fact is that the building will be rebuilt, but that's not what the symbol was about. The symbol is about what's in us. And that's a concept that we gradually have to grok. And so I hope that's enough of an answer. So logos is the rational side. We need the rational side for everything that we build. Okay, everything that you can see in this picture behind me was built, made by a human being from the rational side. But there's still the irrational side too, and that's what's important, and that's what gets our further development, because if there wasn't irrational, if there weren't new ideas that sprung from the old ideas, then we'd still have the original iPhone. But we keep advancing the iPhone, we keep advancing the webcam, and the internet, which we're using right now, is a symbol of our vulnerability now. Okay, as Hosni Mubarak learned when he tried to shut down the internet during the Arab Spring, he shut it down, and all of a sudden food wasn't getting delivered to the people of Egypt. And so after 5 days, he had to turn it back on. But that's a vulnerability that we all have, because if something were to happen to take electric power and or the internet away from us, then we would be back in caveman days. Then we would go back to primitive behaviors. And so there's no way out while you're in it. We have, if we don't want to live primitively, we have to go forward. And that means accepting the irrational, including new ideas. And even BTS is a new idea. And obviously, at some depth level, BTS is a symbol of what is needed in society, because we've had this period of rampant rationality and logos over the last 25 to 50 years, especially. And so no one could have predicted BTS rationally before they emerged. No other K-pop band broke through in this way. And so no one could have rationally predicted it, but it came from the irrational side, and they're symbolic of the rational side. And we need to understand the power of that. That's the power of love and the power of the irrational side. And understanding that this is not the destruction of Notre Dame. It's not the destruction of Notre Dame. It's the destruction of a structure, of a building. Okay. And so understanding that it's not the destruction of Notre Dame is starting to get why the irrational is important, and why this concept of cosmogonic love that Dr. Jung refers to is very important. I hope that's helpful, Penelope. That was a good question. Let me see if I can find the next thing. Okay. Wow, when I moved my chat, it popped up on me, and so now I've lost my place. Okay. Sean says, how is judgment relinquished by the eros? Well, if you're talking about logic is the opposite of the rational side versus the eros side. So it's a syzygy. It's a set of opposites. But, judgment has so many meanings that we can't strictly say. I mean, there's judgment in eros too, and where the dividing lines are and how it works in the moving of the yin yang symbol. I can't explore that. I mean, you could write probably a book on that one question. If the structure has been built and the stream has flown into the cracks, new things happen. Joshua says, pardon my ignorance, but what does BTS stand for? BTS stands for this Korean boy band, which has taken over the world by storm and has 80 million followers now. And they have just launched a new album, which is based on Jungian psychology and based on this book by Dr. Mary Stein called Jung's Map of the Soul, an Introduction. Their new album is called Map of the Soul Persona. And so BTS is the name of that band. And so there's been some explanation going on among BTS Army members. So thank you for that. Amy says, and in English, BTS means bulletproof Boy Scouts. And so in a sense, metaphorically, that's the idea that all the rationalism in the world can't get rid of them. They're great, and they're coming from the opposite side of pure rationality. If pure rationality was in control, then there wouldn't be a BTS. But because they exist, now you can see what the other side is about. And it's bulletproof. It can't be defeated by rationality because it's irrational. And it doesn't mean it's wrong when I say irrational. I mean only that it's the opposite of thinking it out perfectly. I've got strength. Says Suga, in his song The Last, was talking about his experience of trying to find happiness in the outer world. He felt like he was becoming a monster while only chasing success. Success is subjective. Yes, success is just another thing in the world. Suga used another pseudonym, August D, for The Last. I'll send a link to the song later. Thank you. And Center Bush says, hey guys, sorry I'm late. Can't stay longer either. Family plans today. We'll have to catch up later. So Center Bush, I want to point out to you, though, since you're here, or were here, I hope you're still here, that there was a conversation on Twitter that involved one of your responses from an earlier video. And let's see if I can find it. And I will, if I do find it, I will be able to describe it to you. Okay, so it was promoted by a Twitter account, which I cannot at the moment find, but in any case, it was one of your longer responses, and it developed a very long chain of discussion, and I thought it was an excellent chain of discussion, so I wanted to share it with you. And so maybe tomorrow I will begin with that. The Twitter ID of where this chain can be found is at Magic Shop Books, all one word. And it's BTS and Books is the handle, but the Twitter account, and I'll just put it here so everybody can find it, is at Magic Shop Books, and he quoted you. And then there's this long and very useful discussion under his quote of you. So you might want to look at that. And so BTS Army says, yes, love and happiness are always an outer thing. So I genuinely believe that man should sign this psychological contract to accept it and adapt it as a feeling. It's not an outer thing. I'm sorry. It's maybe superficially an outer thing, but it's an inner thing too. And then BTS Army says, I said love and happiness are outer, since when a beloved one dies, we feel sad. Death is outer. Well, death is outer, but as I said earlier, I don't believe that people die. And so Senator Bush says, I will keep chat running on speaker, but I have to start prepping for today. So if I don't actively moderate, that's why. BTS, sometimes Sean is so deep that I don't relate. Sean is a very deep and very loyal follower of this channel, and I appreciate that. Jeff Hadfield says, I posted paragraph 357 from Jung's volume 6, Psychological Types, on Instagram, which no one cared about, haha, and it goes nicely with this talk of love and the Notre Dame tragedy. Thank you for that pointer, Jeff. I'll take a look at that paragraph afterward, and paragraph 356 as well. And BTS Army says, like people today want just to consume infos and don't bother questioning the existence. Well, that's a very superficial life. And I think what happens, and I think Dr. Jung would explain it this way, that when you're going toward midlife, when you're coming up from being an infant, you are learning. Okay, you learn from the time you open your eyes and your mother gives you a nipple. From that moment on, you're learning. And so most people learn from outer things through that whole period, which in Dr. Jung's time continued on to about age 35 to 45. And then there's a midlife crisis. And then you have to find something inside. And so let's see, what was the point here? And so when you're consuming info, and it's all outer, and you're not questioning, that's this growing up period, which is the hero's journey. The hero's journey gets you to a point. But think of Star Wars. Okay, so Star Wars, the very first episode, which is episode 4, ends with Luke Skywalker coming into this hall with all these people standing at attention, and they're all honoring him. But then what? Okay, then what? Once you achieve that pinnacle, that heroic pinnacle, then what's happened to Luke after that? Okay, and that's the issue. Carla says, your Mephistopheles vision reminds me of a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne called Young Goodman Brown. Yes, I've got strength. I think love is an inner thing. Love doesn't die when a loved one dies. Love lives on, and we may find a tiny bit of happiness even in difficult situations, like when you live in a bad situation, but you may still be happy about the fact that you live, surely. And BTS Army says, memory loops kill the living. We forget the love we had for someone. As time goes by, our memories fade away, or maybe we are the one that chose to forget to escape nostalgia and reminiscence. Yeah, fair enough. And it says, kill the love, well, that's really a bad way to live your life. So your head hurts, take naps, and after this live stream, I do intend to. This has been a very intense 2-week period or 3-week period, and keeping up, I can no longer keep up with my Twitter feed. So I'm very grateful for all the people that are following me on Twitter. I do try to follow people back, and I also try to follow people who have retweeted tweets of mine. It's, in terms of Twitter health, let's say, today I got stopped by Twitter because I was trying to follow too many people. And so, it's better to retweet rather than like, because I'm losing the ability to get back to all the likes. So if you retweet, I will try to follow you back, but Twitter restricts me. So if you want a follow between me and you, please do follow me, and I will do my best to follow back. I'm struggling to keep up, but I will do my best. Senator Bush says, I read Young, Goodman, Brown in high school. It was trippy back then, but I loved reading it. Really made me think. And I've got Strength says, for me, love is a broad thing. I can't attach it only to relationship. There's a special kind of meditation for cultivating love, like a boundless friendliness to all creatures, starting from yourself. And in Buddhism, I think that's called compassion also, but we'd have to have a conversation on that. Jeff says, yes, unconditional love. Eckert's view of the fusion of God and man. Absolutely. Putting oneself in touch with consciousness, not a concept that the church likes. And right, because they want to intermediate. But you have to realize that it is possible to have a religious experience where you no longer need to believe, that is this fusion between God and man, and it means that each of us can live a little bit of the divine in us. And so we realize that we have to take responsibility for the creation of the good in society. It's our responsibility. Penelope says, I like that story. Grenade, what advice would you give to someone, again, it disappeared on me, I'm sorry. Goodness. A lot of responses here. And so one thing I would mention is that I do appreciate the following, and you can help me a little bit by defraying my costs by giving a super chat or something. And I will always try to respond to super chats, but I'm having trouble keeping up with the Twitter feed or the chat feed. I'll try to look at the chats after if I don't get to you today. Let's see, where were we? Can't find. All right, I'm just going to start again. Carlos says, okay, that was the young boy. Grenade, what advice would you give to someone who has a hard time loving and trusting people? What advice would I give? I guess my best advice, and I'm not a mental health professional, but my best advice is to get a life, to go out and start living your life and making mistakes, and let love and trust emerge on their own. It's not a question of here's a handy dandy logos oriented book about love, and if I read that, I've got it. It doesn't work that way. I mean, love comes from the irrational side of life, and trust does too. And so you know it when you've got it. And so the best thing that anybody can do is go out and literally get a life, start doing something. And I think the problem we have with nihilism among young people today is that they're sitting on their sofa and they're not trying to do anything because they're afraid of making a mistake. And, we made a lot of, at least in the United States, we made a lot of weak people in the 80s and 90s, maybe back as far as the 70s, by saying, okay, everybody gets a trophy, or mother comes and argues about whether her child is the best or not against the teacher or the coach or whatever it is. And we have to have defeats. Okay, we have to make mistakes, and we have to go through this Job archetype: contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth. Okay, and we have to go through that cycle many times in our lives, and that makes strong individuals. But this is why I frequently say, if you're not making a mistake every day, you're not trying hard enough. And so what you have to do is go out and try something, anything, it doesn't matter. If it's not a mistake and this is the right thing for you, keep going. But if it turns out to be a mistake, then lament about the mistake, about the defeat, and then move on, go do something else. And so if you do that, you're going to know who you love and who you trust. And you can't get that from a book. And so I've got strength. We know that having sexual relationships doesn't equal sharing love, though. Yes, that's very definitely true. I don't know where my previous sentence went. I said we can share love to many people simultaneously, but have sexual relationships only with one person in case of monogamy. I think that is different strokes for different folks. And obviously, civilization has demonstrated over thousands of years that marriage and, in general, monogamy is a good idea. And it reduces friction in the society. But on the other hand, monogamy isn't everything. And so before, in prior centuries, there was no public service, there was no public welfare. And so, for example, in the Muslim world, it was very common for many of the men to be killed in battle. And so they would leave wives and children who were unable to fend for themselves. And so the reason polygamy or multiple wives emerged in the Muslim world was it was a kind of welfare. And in the Quran, it's normal that if you have more than one wife, you have to treat them all the same. And I'm not saying that this is ever done perfectly, but there's a reason why, and it was a logos reason why in Islam multiple spouses occurred. And it was a kind of social welfare in earlier centuries. But today I've seen it from both the male and the female point of view. And as I've said, from the male point of view, it's like hell on earth, because one of the wives is always calling on the telephone wanting something, and you have to juggle the multiple wives. But for the woman, I know a woman who is married, and she's married to a very senior official, and there is another wife, but she likes it because she only has to worry about her husband 3 days a week. So there's different perspectives on these things. and we have to open our minds to why these things exist. It's not a question of forcing them out by a logos-oriented law. And BTS Army, body and the soul are words apart. Yes. Penelope, thank you for explaining logos. I looked also just now, and now I get it. I have to go now, but thank you. Bernard, my rational side is what has a hard time trusting, because rationally I know I should, but something irrational in me says most people should not be trusted. I think it's because of how I grew up. Well, that may be, and so, but you have to teach yourself to love and trust. Nobody's going to be able to tell you about that. You have to experience that, and that's, in psychology, that's the only way you learn. And so Senator Bush is still listening, so I presume you listened to my comment about your comment from the other day, which was terrific. I've got strength says you are afraid to be hurt. Examine your fears and what is so bad that could happen. What would you really die, or something like that? Maybe you have a hard time dealing with the weakness. Back in the Vietnam era, my generation of men were really threatened by the Vietnam War. I mean, existentially threatened, because 58,000 of us were killed in that war. 3 of my personal friends, and things can be very tough, but in those days we had a saying, well, it ain't my wife and it ain't my life, so why worry? And so if, it's worrisome if you're going to lose your wife, and it's worrisome if you're going to die, but if there's anything less than that, then, move on, keep going. And so at least that's always been my attitude toward it. I just saw this morning, I was so surprised, it made my day. Yeah, okay, good. I've got strength says, not strong enough behind those walls to be able to deal with the world. Grenade, that's the thing, though. I've already analyzed and asked myself, what's the worst that can happen? It's beyond that. In fact, the analytical way of dealing with it is my preferred function. Okay, well, so sometimes people do need help from a mental health professional, and I wouldn't be the last one to say that you shouldn't talk to someone who knows a lot more than me. I'm not a mental health professional. I just know, for me, my experience, my real psychological experience, is that by reading Dr. Jung, I've been helped very much personally in my own life. And that's why I started writing and talking about this. And so, but sometimes you do need a professional to help you along. And, that's not me. I'm not a mental health professional. So he says, like I said, it goes beyond rationality for me. It may well. And all I know is that it goes back possibly to before my ego was fully formed. It may well. And, but Dr. Jung was rather against the idea of reductionism. Dr. Freud was about, working back through your history to everything back to the earliest times, and then he would say, and it's all about sex. Well, it's not all about sex. And Dr. Jung points out that, there are many things that happen. And so, draw a corral around that part of your psyche and say, okay, that's the way I've been up to now. How am I going to be going forward? Because that's all we can do, is decide how we're going to be going forward. And we don't have to let what happened to you control what happens in the future. All we have to do is decide how are we going to be now, regardless of what happened in the future. And so that's one of the fundamental differences between Freudian psychology and Jungian psychology, where Freud wanted to reduce everything to sex, and the problem is, and so Freud's idea was you lie somebody on a couch and you just let them free associate back to everything. And so eventually, if you do that, you free associate back to the universe, and you never get anywhere. And so Dr. Jung was saying, okay, through dreams, we can say, what is your psyche saying to you now based on who you are now? And that was a more productive approach from his point of view, and I believe it was. And Bernard says, do you have a decent life? I have friends I hang out with regularly about to graduate from college, and I'm talking to a potential girlfriend. I don't know if that's what it is. Well, I don't know. I couldn't tell you what a decent life is going to be for you. And, you need to try it out. You need to get out in life and make mistakes. And then, you will fail. There will be failure. And, if you're not failing, keep going. If you're failing, go lament about that. Go to a church and pray, or go out and stare at the stars or whatever it is, but then go on to the next thing, whatever it is. And it doesn't mean you have to keep going on a track that is not working for you. I've got strength. It still sounds like there's some clinging to a fear. Maybe try not to analyze like usual. Try to feel more. I didn't mean the very rational approach. Okay, I'm not commenting on mental health issues. Joshua, if I may add to the making weak people, social media turns a redeemable mistake into a public forum. In short, it provides a mass audience for ridicule therefore making you terrified to try anything. I think it can have that effect. And by the same token, you can find that you don't have a life. So there's an element of it where you're learning, okay? And so people are learning around the world about Jungian psychology, and for that, I'm very grateful. But at the same time, there can be too much of that, and you need to go out and experience and learn from that. And in the end, you have to be satisfied with yourself, with you, who you are, and that you're not going to find in an iPhone. But I think that many people are going around looking for themselves in an iPhone, thinking somehow that's going to make them happy. It might teach them something, but it's not going to make them happy. Jeff says, I don't think there's all that much that is particularly wrong with distrust in people, because that sort of trust seems to be hinged on expectation, which is often unreasonable. That basis of expectation can most likely be sourced in the one who expects inner problems. What are those problems, and how are those problems compelling behavior and perspective? Okay, I'm not going to comment on that statement, which, I don't know what Jeff's background is, but it sounds like mental health advice, which I do not give, or I try to not give. And I've got strength says, well, you can't really live normally if you worry very much about every death during the war. I understand, Skip. That's the way people choose not to go crazy. I suppose. Bernard, thanks for the advice. Centerbush, I may be changing my YouTube name to match up with my Twitter, just for your information. I have to go for now. See you all tomorrow. Well, send me a little secret message and tell me who's what, so I can identify you when I see you on Twitter. Grenade, I know you're not a mental health professional, but I don't trust most of them, haha, especially if it is a transactional relationship. That's fair enough. You have to make your own judgment about what works for you and what doesn't. And Jeff says, I don't either. I don't think I should, and that's a compliment to them. Miles says, Renard, Toastmasters is a great place to socialize after college ends. People, they're interested in sharing stories, visit their district conferences. It's not a bad idea. Okay, you can go in Toastmasters and make a few mistakes, and it's probably not going to make much difference in your physical life outside of the Toastmasters, but you can learn a lot about interacting with people and learning to trust people and that sort of thing from an organization like Toastmasters. So that's a terrific suggestion, Miles. Now let's see. Okay, we've almost done 2 hours here, and I never did get to Senator Bush's comment from the other day, which I like very much, and I do want to talk about that string of responses, that thread that was on there from the Magic Book Club or whatever it was. I'm sorry, I don't have all these things at my fingertips, but the Magic Shop books. That's that was a good conversation, and I want to discuss it a little further, maybe in the next few days. Grenade says, I do a lot of public speaking, but I definitely need some work. Maybe I should do that. Yep, work works, definitely. YY Castillo says, I'm so late today, I'm going to have to watch it. Yep. Okay, yes, you are, because this is about love and the power devil, and we can see the manifestation of the power devil in the president of the United States right now, because he's gone for power in many respects, come hell or high water, and so he's achieved what everyone would think is material success. Okay, you can't deny that he's got his own building, he's got his own plane, and now he's become president of the United States, and he's clawed himself to the top of the heap in every possible way. But is he happy? Is he going to leave office in shame? I don't know, but I can't imagine that there's anybody watching this, including him, who can say unequivocally that he's a happy man. And so that's a worthwhile consideration, because, they talk about people being empty suits. Well, that's the bully who's yellow inside. A hard-boiled egg is always yellow inside, and that's an opposition. So there's so many opposites. And so, this is something my father taught me when I was in the 4th grade about bullies, that a hard-boiled egg is always yellow inside. And now I understand why that can be said, because the bully is protecting a very weak inner person. And so if they're challenged, they back down. Okay, this is why when the White House counsel refused to fire Mr. Mueller, the president had to back down, okay, because the White House counsel stood up to him and said, no, you can't do this, and I'm not going to do it. And so, that's a perfect example in our real life. The last week, which is exactly what I'm talking about. And so that's the power devil, which is the opposite of love. Okay, so Dr. Jung was very clear that the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is power. Okay, the seeking of power. And so, um, we can see that in our social life in the United States and around the world. Every place that people have gotten absolute power, tyranny, ultimately they fail. And this was if you go back and look at the movie Gandhi, you can hear the Gandhi character saying, think of it, in all the world, there has been tyranny, and tyranny for a time can seem very strong. But in the end, it always fails. Think of it, always. Why does it fail? Because it's empty. There's nothing there. It's an empty suit. And so ultimately, love prevails. I mean, it may kill millions of people. I'm not saying that it's not powerful. It is power, okay? But there has to be a balance between love and power. And if you don't have that balance, then you don't really have a true human life, because that's the uniqueness of the human individual, because each one of us carries the ability to walk between too soft, too mushy, lovey-dovey type thing and too powerful. Okay, and we have to have logos, and we have to have eros too. We have to have a life. We need to get a life. And so we can have logos. We can have logos 100% perfectly in making a product, for example, and it's very necessary. And so many men are very logos oriented because they're into the process of building things, for example. But in the end, you have to have life too, because you build a thing, and if nobody uses it, it's useless. Okay, very, very clearly. And so, what is hate then? I've got strength says, what is hate then? Well, that's, I guess that would be a different facet of this inexplicable, irrational thing that we call love. Okay. And so this is what I read at the beginning of this video, where I read Dr. Jung's discussion, where he said in his whole life, and he worked on it as diligently as anyone, he has never been able to explain what love is. And the reason is because love is like an uncut diamond, and it has many facets. And every time there's a facet of something, there's an opposition to that facet. And so that's what we were talking about. The Red Book is an uncut diamond. And those of us who know the Red Book very well and have read it thoroughly multiple times, we know how much wisdom is in it. And but it has many, many facets. And, when the Red Book first came out, I was taking a lesson from a person who was in the process of tweeting out every verse in the Bible. And so I said, well, okay, I can start to tweet out the Red Book sentence by sentence. But, typically if there's a paragraph, that's one set of ideas. And so if I wanted, if you tweet them out in the same order, so I would find, let's say, 5 sentences in the Red Book, and they contain a certain amount of wisdom. And so I wanted to tweet those out, but I wanted them to be read in correct order. But if I put them in in the order that they appear in the book, they'd be in reverse order on Twitter. And so I realized that, and I decided, okay, I'm going to take this set of 5 sentences and I'm going to tweet it out in reverse order, 1 sentence at a time. And so then if anybody goes back and looks at my timeline, they'll see it in the proper order. And that was very logical and sensible. But what I found by experience when I did that was these paragraphs make absolutely the same amount of sense and contain the same amount of wisdom, whether you read it in reverse order or forward order. And so, wow, that's interesting. That's an interesting fact. And so love is like that. I mean, and that's why Dr. Jung admitted in this book, Memory Streams Reflections, that he could never put his finger on it because love has many facets. And so, okay, hate is an opposite of love also. But typically what we think of is that that hate is the only opposition to love, but power is also an opposition to love. And I think that's my point. But that's quite a fair question. I acknowledge that it was a good question. Let's see. Yes, I do agree. I've got strength that it's a hard concept to grasp. And, very often I only get these things myself when I'm pressed. So you've had me extemporaneously pull up something that maybe I hadn't been thinking consciously before this. And Grenade says, indifference is worse than hate or love. Yes, I agree with that. Okay, we have been at it for over 2 hours. I'm going to discontinue for today, but I will do my best to continue on tomorrow. And I've got strength says, I would rather go with feeling indifference. Hate is scary. Well, I think we have to consider wholeness. And I know that I personally have transformed since I have been looking at the political situation in the United States, and particularly with the election of our current president. And I find that I can only have compassion because he obviously got put into a very bad track early on. I think he's going to end in, his presidency is going to end in shame, and he'll be remembered as a shameful chapter in our history, and it's going to be devastating. I think that he probably has destroyed his entire organization and himself in the process of what he's done. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge that many of the things that he has done make sense to me at some level. And, we can't deny the fact that he brought Kim Jong-un to the negotiating table by behaving in what seemed like an irrational manner. And he created those 2 conferences. The problem is that he probably had some sort of objective for that, like winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And if he could get Kim Jong-un to agree to give up his nuclear weapons, then maybe he would win the Nobel Peace Prize. But you can't just go to somebody and say, you've got to change, or I'm gonna, or I'm gonna what? Because causing a war on the Korean Peninsula would be absolutely devastating and kill millions of people on both sides. And everybody knows that. And so Kim Jong-un is not going to respond to rational arguments. There have to be some irrational things that are going to change the situation. And so far, we have lots of rational people that have been dealing with that situation, both Americans and Koreans, and many others, Chinese and Russians as well, for over 70 years. And by a rational approach, we haven't changed much. I mean, literally, North Korea is literally still at war with the United Nations. There's only been an armistice, not a treaty or a peace. And so we have to think on the other side of our brain to figure out how it now ends. And so, I see many of the decisions that the president has made over the last 2.5 years that do work. They may not be the way I would have done something, but they make sense, and I have to recognize that. And I also have to recognize that my fellow Americans who are not of my political persuasion are still my brothers and sisters, and they still are American, and I want to be a part of a country that they're part of, because that is what that psychic energy that goes back in our society is what makes the country strong. Okay. And if we understand that the debates, people around the world can't understand our debates. Why are you always arguing with one another? But that's how we find the right solutions ultimately. So, there's a famous quote from Winston Churchill, which is that Americans always find the right answer after trying everything else. And it's the kind of the way it works. And so it makes sense. It just says hate comes from something within that needs to be worked on. Certainly that's true. Love is a multifaceted diamond and shines with a rainbow of colors. Yes, thank you, Miles. I love your emoticons there, Jeff. A misunderstanding from within produces misunderstanding of things without, and anger manifests accordingly. Ignorance to fear, to anger, to hate, hatred, to violence. Yes. At least indifference can be based on some sort of understanding. Fair enough. Sherry says, negativity always takes up more energy than positivity and love. Hate is such a strong emotion, so much so that I try to say I hate something. I try not to say I hate something unless it is something truly vile and evil. This is... Okay, so this is Center Bush, change more to match my Twitter. Okay, I have to really go now. Much love to all, and lots of hearts. Now, if we can figure out how to change my picture. Yeah, technology, computer, it's my favorite expletive for the last 35 years. I've got strength. I just totally hated some people who encourage war, couldn't even listen to them. Filthy hypocrites. Sorry, guys, I'm better now. Cultivating love in a broad sense and calmness. Well, that's better. And, we all have those emotions, and I certainly do. Um, those hypocrites have killed my friends, have destroyed my life savings, and many other things. And but I find that the Buddhist and Hindu concept of karma works perfectly, and I've found it works perfectly throughout my life. And so, if I am vengeful towards someone or I hate someone, I find that if I remember karma, then I know that um, they will get theirs. I mean, karma is the Buddhist word for what goes around comes around, and um, and so that's not just a casual um, saying. What goes around comes around isn't just a casual saying. It is a representation of the concept of karma, and karma works perfectly. There is balance in the universe, and karma works to the fourth generation. So um, when we see someone that is really out of kilter, um, they will get theirs in due course, whether I do anything or not. And and I find that this works perfectly in my life, um, and I never have had to uh, take any violent or vengeful action because karma does it for me. Why does that work? I don't know. It's a mystery, but it certainly does work. And so that's why having calmness does help if you can remember karma, because the universe is in balance. And Grenade says war is peace. Well, yeah, okay. I think you've not served in the military, sir. And yeah, this is George Orwell. He's quoting George Orwell. George Orwell saw a lot of things that were coming in our society. Who can deny that we don't have Brave New World today? In many ways, and in many societies in different ways, and but we don't have to decide things with violence, as I've Got Strength points out, and you don't have to, because karma works perfectly. And the point of this discussion between Grenade and I've Got Strength here is that war and peace are a syzygy that are yoked together. They're a pair of opposites, and in that sense, they're always part of one another. And what we have to start to understand is how we can live in peace. And so if we look at American history, okay, one time the violence got the better of us and we had the Civil War, and that killed nearly 1 million men and women. But since the Civil War, at least within our society, although we've had many heinous acts, we haven't gone to war with one another. And most of the time, we control our society and actually make it stronger by very strong, vigorous debates. But we ultimately see where we want America to be, and that gets represented every time we have an election. And so we see that manifest from the collective unconscious on every election day. And so, anyway, war is peace in the sense that it's a pair of opposites that are always yoked together. And Ian says, can you discuss how you address malevolence? Well, there is malevolence in the world, and I've certainly faced my share of it over the last decade, and that's a very long story that maybe will be told more in the coming year. But basically, the way I deal with malevolence is by knowing that karma works perfectly. I think that's the best way, and finding a way to keep my cool in the face of injustice and hate of me for various reasons, whatever it is. I mean, we certainly saw malevolence come on this chat stream earlier, and in that particular video, I don't remember which one it was on, but if you find it, you'll see that I got rather flustered when it was happening, when the hackers were here and they were being vicious and using vicious attacks on people in the chat stream, and that was terrible. And because I was in the moment, I couldn't work up an answer to that. But now I have. And so on that occasion, you see that I finally just shut down the stream because I didn't have an answer at that time. But I lamented on it. That was a defeat of me when I shut down the stream. But then I lamented about that defeat, and I was reborn stronger in the sense that I've appointed several other chat moderators in this group, and they know that they can file complaints about those people immediately as they come up on the stream. And they also know that I will block and formally file reports with YouTube. And so then those trolls will lose their privileges. And so, we don't have to accept an attack on us. We can respond, and we can use it as a teaching moment. So if a troll comes onto this chat stream right now, I can say, well, there's a demonstration of the American shadow, and so it's a pure demonstration of the shadow, and so not only can we recognize it, but we can also act to push it out of our society, and we all can do that. And so far, that's worked pretty well. We've only had one live stream that was seriously interrupted by trolls, and I hope that continues. And Jeff says, a nice little hero's journey cycle and dealing with those trolls there. Well, I don't know if I'm a hero, but many of you that have followed these videos have also been heroes by keeping the moderation under control. And, if I think about it and think, oh yeah, it'd be kind of fun to be a troll and, go out and start to yak at people, you can see that you could get sucked into that kind of way of being. And it's shocking to know that about yourself, that you could get into that. But, for me, in terms of this YouTube channel, it's simply a demonstration of the shadow. So I need to say, okay, there you are, there it is. But sometimes you have to lament and work on what these things mean and how they work for you, and while you do, you may have to withdraw and lament and pray and whatever it takes to get yourself under control so that you can deal with it. So anyway, thank you for your comments, and thank you for being here today. I am going to discontinue at this time because this has gotten a bit too long again. I'll do my best to be here again tomorrow. Thank you for being here today. I'm done, Deb.